So much of the Scott Pilgrim franchise didn't originate from Scott Pilgrim. Kim Pine was originally from Bryan Lee O'Malley's webcomic style, character names and designs are pulled from the author's real-life music tastes, even the whole indie rock band scene. Scott Pilgrim wasn't the first time O'Malley used that. What would you think of if I said there was a fictional band in an early 2000s series comprised of young adults who were kind of bad and they absolutely knew it, and got dragged into some over-the-top fight for their lives because one of their members managed to personally piss off a man in high power? Obviously, you're likely thinking of Sex Bob-Omb, the band with Scott Pilgrim on bass, Stephen Stills on vocals, Kim Pine on drums, and young Neil as Scott's understudy / #1 fan. Well, at least until Chau entered the picture.
There's always Scott's understudy.
Oh my gosh, when?
But what if I told you that exact, fairly specific description wasn't just referring to Sex Bob-Omb? As it turns out, the Scott Pilgrim author was already toying with the idea of an indie band caught up in wild, fantastic scenarios before the first graphic novel even released. And he was including these ideas in his comics online when he was still a relatively unknown indie artist. O'Malley was very into the indie band scene ever since college, and so naturally, Scott Pilgrim wasn't his only project to feature those influences. However, his webcomic World End Solutions 2003 was definitely setting up some much higher stakes, and an even more personal vendetta than Ramona Flowers and her 7 evil ex-boyfriends.
7 evil exes, yes.
So, I'm Oro from Zombie Comics, and this is a story about a time long before Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. It's a story about the indie rock band scene in Canada, the musicians and songs that inspired the Scott Pilgrim band, God's personal grudge against music, and one character's daring escape into the Scott Pilgrim series. It's the story of a sort of proto Sex Bob-Omb in Bryan Lee O'Malley's unfinished webcomic, World End Solutions 2003. You know, as far as character design goes, Scott's pretty nondescript. We got the Netflix Scott Pilgrim anime, but when you say anime protagonist, you usually think of some wild, outlandish look. But Scott? Nope, he just wears his t-shirts, sometimes a star, sometimes Plumtree. Wait, what the hell does Plumtree mean?
You really don't know about the League?
Well, it turns out that this shirt is a reference to how the character of Scott Pilgrim came about at all. When O'Malley was in high school in the mid-90s, he would tune into the college radio station from the University of Western Ontario. He would even set his alarm clock to it. And one morning he heard a song called In the Sink by the all-girl band Plumtree. And he and his sister Stacy, I wonder what character she inspired, became obsessed. They bought their albums, they followed their tours, and when O'Malley found out Plumtree was touring in London, Ontario, they absolutely went. And they even got to hang out with the band afterwards. And that's when he recalls hearing a song titled Scott Pilgrim. And it's not just Scott. Stephen Stills gets his name directly from real-life singer and guitarist Stephen Arthur Stills, who co-founded the band Buffalo Springfield, a band which also included singer and songwriter Neil Young. Even outside of the main band, Lynette, the drummer for The Clash at Demon Head, gets her name directly from one of the Plumtree members, Lynette Gillis. If you couldn't tell, these experiences in the indie rock scene and music world in general stuck with O'Malley. In fact, he even makes music under the name Kupek. But that's a story for another time. It's only natural the love for these experiences would come out in his webcomics and graphic novels. But before Sex Bob-Omb had officially assembled in Scott Pilgrim's precious little life, before they ever even faced down Matthew Patel and his demon hipster chicks, or the Katayanagi twins, O'Malley was building up another band. One that was going up against an opponent far more powerful than anything the Evil Exes could summon. The year was 2003. O'Malley's first graphic novel, Lost at Sea, was still months away from release, and he had started preliminary sketches for Scott Pilgrim. One night in February, he got to work on a webcomic, and he didn't resurface until he had created a nearly 50-panel comic called World End Solutions 2003, and this was just meant to be the first installment.
It was an old idea that had been kicking around his skull and sketchbook since, August 1998. During a summer trip to Vermont, O'Malley had a dream involving a terrible end-of-the-world scenario, complete with mixtapes and rock kicks. And that's what this is.
Since these panels were all done in a single night, they're obviously a lot sketchier and less cleaned up than O'Malley's usual style, but it's still unmistakably his. As to why it's in a monochrome of pink and white, I'm just gonna have to say it's a stylistic choice. The comic opens on a band of 4 young adults, including female vocalist Emily, moments before they performed their last show ever. We're not told right away why. Are they breaking up? Did something happen? Whatever the reason, Emily addresses her bandmates, the female guitarist, this definitely not Scott Pilgrim bass player, and the bald drummer. Don't worry, Kim, it's not a girl drummer this time.
They have a girl drummer.
She says that even though they don't want things to end, eventually everything does. And then she gives the countdown. And then we're jarringly informed that the world is ending in 9 months, on October 10th, 2003. Spoilers, the title knew what it was talking about. We cut back to their performance as the band plays on, and Emily sings lyrics about dreams and God and things getting worse. It's not that the world is going to end in 9 months, it already started. Offstage, we get to see a small glimpse of the band's dynamics when Emily breaks down, saying that she tried to be good, but any consolation fails to reach her. Clearly, this initial setup pits not just Emily, but the entire band against some pretty big odds. And from what we later find out, while it's mainly Emily's fight, the whole band is tied to things too. It's kind of a perfect parallel to Scott Pilgrim and Sex Bob-Omb. It is Scott who has to defeat Ramona's 7 evil exes that took Gideon Graves who knows how long to organize.
Like 2 hours! 2 hours!
But Scott's band gets drawn into several of his fights. When it comes to the graphic novels, they play a direct role in helping Scott defeat Matthew Patel when he bursts into the rocket, interrupting their performance. Later, in Volume 5, Scott Pilgrim vs. the Universe, Scott has to face off against the Katinagi twins and their killer robots. At the time, Steven Stills had them recording for the past few months, and they hadn't played an actual show for a while. But suddenly Julie Powers hit them with a gig. However, it turned out to be a trap meant to corner Scott, and the band is caught up in his fight yet again. The Scott Pilgrim movie had them even more involved. Instead of taking on Kyle and Ken Katinagi with his fists, they duel in a battle of the band's throwdown, complete with a kaiju battle. Only for the band to later sign with Gideon Graves at the first opportunity. I mean, hey, a gig is a gig.
I hate you. A gig is a gig is a gig is a gig.
So of course, the band is right there during the final showdown at the Chaos Theater. Even the Scott Pilgrim game has Ramona and the band as the main playable characters, giving Kim Pine and Steven Stills their own moves to take down enemies. Not to mention, they're present for most fights and have a personal stake in many of them. Like when Scott faces Todd Ingram and they have to deal with Envy Adams being in town. But beyond the similarities, the story of World End Solutions looked to take things in a very different direction compared to Scott Pilgrim. O'Malley really likes his character studies. It's part of the reason why Scott Pilgrim is so hard to summarize. Yeah, what happens is that he fights Ramona's evil exes, but that's not really what the series is about. The story goes way beyond that because it's tied to Scott's back and forth character development. And it definitely seemed like World End was setting up a similar conflict for Emily. After the initial scene of the band's apparent last performance, we get some backstory. Sometime between mid-December 2002 and January 2003, the group went on tour. It was meant to be a 7-week tour for their new album, but as the weeks went on, things started going wrong. By the 3rd week, Emily says that they all sort of knew. By the 5th week, there was no doubt. We see a clip of a world leader, I'll assume the Canadian Prime Minister, addressing the people, and the reader is simply left with the knowledge that God is real and he's ending the world. It seems a little out of character for him, or somewhat out of character for him. So what could suddenly spur him to just end everything? Well, at this point in the comic, we don't know. But what could Emily and her band do? They went ahead and finished out the tour, but there was one last thing Emily hadn't told us. She'd gotten a visitor. Obviously, it's stressful enough performing on a sinking ship, so she was hurling her guts out before the show. And that's when an angel appeared to inform her that the world is ending, and it's all her fault. Because God hates her specifically. Yeah, the angel does not mince words. Since God is omnipresent, he can't just tune out their music. They had a decent amount of fans, so somewhere in the world, someone is always playing their godforsaken music at all times. They're literally godforsaken music. Understandably, this hits Emily pretty hard. I mean, the apparent creator of everything singled her out of the billions of people in the world. The angel said that he hates how she over-enunciates when she sings. That's gotta be a whole new level of self-conscious. But the angel says that there is a solution. A way for Emily to save the world. Here's what they're gonna do. The worst part about this comic is that it ended on a cliffhanger and was never followed up. And it probably never will, which I think is kind of a huge shame. The setup is great, almost like a twist on Lovecraftian horror, where you have a relatively unremarkable individual up against literal gods beyond comprehension. And with a bit of Sex Bob-Omb sprinkled in. That one fervent night in February 2003 was the only time that Bryan Lee O'Malley would work on World End Solutions. Of course, similar to how pieces and parts of his webcomic style would find their way into Scott Pilgrim, like the reinvention of Kim Pine, Lisa Miller, and more, you can see elements of World End reflected in Scott Pilgrim. Which, by the way, I already did a whole video about O'Malley's web series style and how almost every part of it was repurposed for something in Scott Pilgrim. If you haven't seen it, I'll have a link on screen. He's done tons of webcomics that most people don't know about. So if you'd like to stick around for more videos like this and more about the wider world of webcomics, why not subscribe, like, and let me know what else you'd like to see me cover. But back to O'Malley and World End, it's also understandable why this online comic never saw a follow-up. O'Malley's life was tumultuous at the time. In a bonus Scott Pilgrim behind-the-scenes page, O'Malley revealed that he moved back and forth between California and Canada, went through a particularly bad breakup, started dating again, and between all that he moped around Toronto with his roommate Chris and shot the shit about this Scott Pilgrim guy and all the things that could happen in his world. His world would be like our world, only way better. On top of that, Lost at Sea released later that year, and he was already working on the first Scott Pilgrim graphic novel, which would release less than a year later in July 2004. Then he'd get right to work on Volume 2, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And before the books had even finished, he was shaking hands with Edgar Wright for the live-action Scott Pilgrim movie. And life has only gotten busier for him. Whether he's working on series like Snot Girl or bringing back the classic characters for Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, O'Malley seems to always have his hands full nowadays. And even if we never learn the titular solution to the end of the world, or see more of how Emily deals with the knowledge that the universe hates her specifically, she may have actually made it out of her unfinished webcomic and into the Scott Pilgrim series right under everyone's noses. We don't get to see much of Kim Pine's life outside of the band in the live-action Scott Pilgrim movie. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off gives us a little bit more, like her job at the movie rental store, but still nowhere near as much as the graphic novels give us. If you thought Scott's living situation with Wallace Wells was bad, Kim's might be in contention for having it worse. Early in Book 4, Scott Pilgrim Gets It Together, Scott and Stephen Stills help her move in with her co-worker Holly Hawkins and Joseph Z? But prior to this, Kim's living situation was kind of a nightmare. In a Scott Pilgrim spin-off that O'Malley created for the 2007 Comics Festival, we see Kim Pine interacting with her 3 previous roommates. University student Sarah, a very particular kind of girl constantly complaining about Kim's habits, stoner Tracy, who blames everything on everyone else, and lastly, the bread-stealing Emily. Kim's former roommates appear very briefly throughout the series, with Sarah and Emily attending the Clash at Demon Head concert, though Scott doesn't even know Emily's name. So, was this another case of reinvention? Like Kim Pine, Lisa Miller, and Lauren Wood from Style? Well, while I wanted to put a spotlight on this detail, since I doubt it would ever come up again, I don't think this is Emily reinvented from World End. The 2 girls really look nothing alike. They don't act the same, they really only have the name in common. Though, when it comes to name, O'Malley is usually very particular. There's a story behind pretty much everyone's name, even down to the side characters. So while I can't say that this incredibly obscure Scott Pilgrim character was absolutely the daring escape for Emily from her unfinished comic, I can't say I'd be surprised if it kind of was. And that's that. I hope you enjoyed this glimpse into the world of this sort of proto Sex Bob-Omb. And until next time, I'll catch you on the flip side. See ya!